revolution.
And with those words, George Bush began the war on terror, focusing the world's attention in one direction, toward Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, and then Iraq. Not where it logically should have gone.
There's clear evidence that the Bush administration and President Bush personally did not want the hardest part, the clearest part of the information gathered indicating Saudi involvement in 9/11 to come out.
15 of the 19 hijackers that day were Saudi, but the White House would rather you didn't know this. In fact, it deliberately hushed it up.
The last 28 pages, the last chapter, if you like, of the Congressional Joint Inquiry report have been totally redacted, suppressed, censored.
The real story of 9/11 didn't begin in New York on a bright September day. It began in Kabul, Christmas Eve, 1979. The Soviet Union sends 30,000 troops into Afghanistan in an ill-fated attempt to secure the country and its oil pipelines for the Kremlin. Washington sees an opportunity, and President Jimmy Carter approves a covert plan, Operation Cyclone, to fund local rebel militias. Before long, the White House finds a partner willing to match its financing in the House of Saud. To keep this all secret, the millions handed over to these fighters was funneled through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI. Why were these countries so willing to work together? Because a mere 6 weeks before the Soviet invasion, the world witnessed this. 52 American hostages, blindfolded and paraded before the cameras. International humiliation for Washington, the final confirmation of the success of the Iranian Revolution, and crucially, a new regime openly hostile to Riyadh. The US and Saudi Arabia now found themselves politically and diplomatically in total agreement, and the rationale for being so was obvious.
Because of oil, because the oil card is the eighth. It had been paramount since the Second World War, when President Roosevelt sat down on a US warship with the King of Saudi Arabia and essentially made the Faustian deal over oil that has lasted from then until now.
And once that deal was struck, it forced the hand of American foreign policy in the region for decades. Even though, as in the case of Afghanistan, Washington failed to realize the long-term consequences, or if it did, chose to ignore them. Ronald Reagan's misunderstanding of the region was so clouded by the Cold War that when he invited Mujahideen leaders to the White House in 1985, he told the American people they were, quote, the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. It wasn't until many years later that Pakistan's former president was honest enough to admit the shared culpability. We helped create the Mujahideen, he said, armed them, paid them, fed them, and sent them to a jihad. Neither did the United States realize what a rich, educated person like Osama bin Laden might later do with the organization that we all had enabled him to establish. The turning point came 5 years later. By the summer of 1990, the Soviet Union was collapsing, which meant the Mujahideen were now surplus to requirements. But that August, Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. Once again, the US and Saudi had a shared strategic and economic interest. No mention was made of the now embarrassing overtures Washington had made to Saddam back when he was helping keeping Iran in check. Instead, the US acted with tacit Saudi approval, using language eerily familiar 13 years later.
As I report to you, air attacks are underway against military targets in Iraq.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations.
We are determined to knock out Saddam Hussein's nuclear bomb potential,
to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
And the similarities cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence.
The Bush administration was determined to simply to keep the boat on an even keel. After all, it was a boat that the Bush family, father and son, had been riding themselves in the oil business for a very long time.
The abandoned rebel fighters now saw a common enemy in Washington and its partner Riyadh, which is why opponents of the ruling family inside Saudi continued to fund and support them. The White House quickly learned of this, but didn't want to rock the boat. The risk to the oil relationship was just too high. So, the evidence was hidden. The narrative was changed, and the war on terror looked elsewhere.